welcome to the Tons of Industry Show. I'm speaking with a first-time guest, Dan Kurz of DKAnalytics.com, who's a good friend of Sean from SGTReport.com, one of our long-standing relationship at WealthResearchGroup.com. And this interview is especially important for investors who have big money at stake in the markets and want to tune into an in-depth Q&A session right now on stock returns over the next coming years, how to prepare and expect what will happen in the future, and where to find value in today's environment. So, first of all, Dan, thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
I am doing well, Lior. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So, you told me you're from Southwest Florida. Just a year ago, August, I was there, and it was half the time it was raining big time. Is it like that right now?
Must have been during the summer. Well, we've been getting drenched with rain. This is the rainy season from June till October, November. We had about 3 inches yesterday, and that usually happens in storms build and you get wonderful cumulus clouds that reach into the sky. I call them the fantasy mountains of Southwest Florida.
Interesting. Okay. Well, you know what? We really want to touch base with you regarding a few topics, and I want to start with, for me, one of the biggest ones, and we've just came out of a period of historically low interest rates. The words ZIRP and NIRP, the acronyms for zero interest rate policies and negative interest rate policies, were created basically during this time, and it's in the U.S., it's in other developed nations. We've seen interest rate hikes right now to the tune of 1.75 to 2% on the Fed fund rate and close to 3% on the 10-year bond. And I want to know how you think rising interest rates impact price appreciation in the stock markets. Today's PE ratios and PS ratio, the price to sales ratios of many companies, and the multiples are quite high, even accounting for the fact that tax cuts have helped to raise guidance for virtually every public company in the U.S. exchanges. So how do you see rising interest rates affect the price valuations of stocks in general? Obviously, dividends account for about 40 to 45% of historical returns. So with half of the returns being price appreciation, what can we expect in the next few years as these interest rates rise, if they rise?
Oh, that's a good broad brushstroke question. That's really the most important thing to get right going forward. A couple of brief remarks. The last comment you made about returns being 40-50% from dividends historically, that's true if we have average dividend yields. We don't. Our dividend yields, that is if you bought stocks today. Okay, everything I'm doing here is referring to fresh money being committed or people that have recently committed. This doesn't apply to the lucky souls, that hold Nestle or Johnson and Johnson or some other great names in the tech business that bought them at a fraction of today's price. Those people really shouldn't be worried because they bought their sliver of earnings at a low PE when considering current earnings power. So my remarks here, I think, have to be prefaced with the fact that this is only applicable for people that bought at current elevated levels or have positions after having purchased at elevated levels. Those positions or those assets are, in fact, in my opinion, going to be potentially marked down substantially. That is, in the vernacular, I think stock prices have a long way to fall if, in fact, two things happen. Interest rates keep going up, number one, and we get an inevitable recession, number two. We haven't had a recession in a good long while in the United States. It's been a very weak, anemic recovery. If you use real inflation numbers, you'd arguably never got out of the recession. But let's use the government statistics, however corrupt they are. And if we take a look at those and we run into the likelihood of a recession today, tomorrow, within a half a year, it's overdue. The business cycle hasn't been outlawed, no matter how much bastardization has occurred, interference, we're going to have it. And in such an environment, even though GDP growth will go from nominal 2 or 3 real, or if even that, into slightly negative, earnings, because their bottom line residual, get whacked. In other words, they can easily go down 40, 50% in a run-of-the-mill recession. I'm talking about earnings per share. Why? If you compare that with current PEs for stocks in, say, the OECD world, which are pretty well over 20 almost everywhere, then you're looking at a potential PE, assuming price is held, of 40 plus, which obviously isn't sustainable. So I think there is going to be an opportunity to repurchase shares at much lower levels, get out of harm's way, bring home capital, and set yourself up for purchase opportunities down the road. And in so doing, it's important to remember something, and I always state this. Lots of analysts mistakenly say we have reversion to the mean. That's a fiction. There's always reversion beyond the mean. It's from boom to bust and from bust back to boom. It's human nature. It's the manic depressive nature of a market. So we're not looking at reversion to the mean. In other words, an average PE of 15, but we could easily go to PEs of 7 or 8, especially if we consider our out of control debt situation, reduced property right protections, and a much weakened rule of law. So this whole thing could set up to be a perfect storm, which people can capitalize on now by getting out of harm's way if they bought near current prices, and position themselves very constructively to potentially being able to buy blue chip stocks yielding not 2%, 1%, 2.5%, but 6 or 7. And that is a huge opportunity if it can be capitalized on, in my opinion.
Now, then I want to make one remark and ask you two follow-up questions that are really short. Now, the one remark I have is that the dividend yield is incredibly low right now compared to historical dividend yields for the S&P 500, but it's also due to the fact that instead of paying out more generous dividends, the companies have undergone insane buyback programs for their own shares, and that might be offsetting the fact that dividend yields could be about 4% today for the S&P 500, but they're obviously not. And it is interesting to find companies that are able to, one, create very generous buyback programs and still pay out big dividends while returning their earnings and while growing their business. And these sort of companies are obviously what enrich individuals the most when they invest in them, and that's obviously what Buffett has been looking for his entire life. These companies that have this brand power or competitive advantage to do everything in a stellar way and avoid recessions and avoid interest rate changes, etc. I do want to ask you two follow-up questions very quickly. One, you said that the United States has reduced rule of law, and two, you said that the United States has reduced property rights. Could you explain both of these real quick, what you meant by them?
Well, yes, rule of law in essence is a constitutional system in the United States, one where a constitution is set up to limit government, not individuals' freedom, but to limit government's ability to determine outcomes, to determine how people live, to determine how much of their earnings they get to keep, and all these other good things. Well, we all know, you know, as an entrepreneur, that systems where free market capitalism works well is the best reward for the most people, because the market with all its excesses is the best allocator and brings the best outcome for the most. It's pretty clear, and history shows it. You can see the difference between China and Hong Kong, and then when China tried to embrace more free market capitalism, it went in the right direction. In the US and in Europe, in my opinion, we are moving away from codified rights, which very much include property rights, which are an essential extension of the word freedom. Because if they can take your property away, they can take away your freedom and how you've spent your time and your ability to feed your family and determine your lifestyle. This has been a long, ongoing process, started in 1913, in essence. Three big things happened there: the federal income tax, the creation of the Fed, senators that were no longer elected by state assemblies. And it's really a global thing. They call it progressivism. I call it regressivism. But what it does is it keeps reducing the incentives or the protections that people have to be able to spend the money that they earn once they pay the tax man in a way that they wish, whether it's for corporate or personal reasons or what have you. It also extends to political correctness. I'm speaking especially of green capital cronyism, or capitalism that in essence allows people to claim that they're protecting the environment when in fact they have other motives. And this has very much polluted our ability to have a sensible, affordable energy policy. It has enriched the Al Gores and other green cronies and miscreants, but it has caused many countries to have unaffordable energy costs. And as you know, productivity is very dependent, and progress is very dependent upon securing energy and copious amounts of it, reliable 24/7, right? We're talking about the fossil fuel complex in essence. And to the degree those things get watered down, or all of a sudden regulators make laws instead of legislatures, which reduce property right protections and end up reducing the ability of the free market to create the best result for the most people, why then you have a move towards impoverishment back in the USSR, if you will. What's currently happening in Venezuela and other places. So this makes it more difficult to achieve growth, productivity, the best outcome for the most people. And it turns it into a game where, in essence, cronies and takers and statists do much better than those that are members of the free market capital system.
Interesting. And obviously, this question goes deeper because what do you do as an individual in this kind of country? Because on one hand, there's a lot of people complaining about what's going on, but what are the choices and options and possibilities that you have as a person in order to live within this kind of environment? Because you're not seeing most Americans complain too much. They go about their lives and they don't even understand that there's big changes happening. So it's a very deep question and a very deep subject. Dan, I want to ask you, where is the logic? Because obviously any person in the world, including any 6-year-old, if you can understand that when you cut taxes and lower the federal revenues while not trimming expenses at the same time, you create larger deficit spending. So obviously this is not a long-term plan. What is the Trump administration plan with regards to cutting taxes but not cutting anything else in the budget?
Good questions. Let me address, if I may, your assumption that most Americans are happy going about their business. Well, I'll tell you, there is a very deep split, a chasm in this country. You've heard it as red states, blue states. I know you mentioned you visited Texas, which is the heartland of the country and a critical state as a bulwark against tyranny. They recently have been moving to get their gold back within their own borders, and Texas used to be a republic, and that might be a preview of coming attractions. But I'm getting off point. My point is simply that if you take a look at the unemployment numbers here, they are fake. If you take a look at most jobs that people have been able to get, they suck. They're part-time. They don't have benefits. They have to work 2 or 3 shifts. I know it here locally. So that's why Trump got elected, because a lot of people are disenchanted with the status quo, with their income, what's happening with their health care. So what do you do about it, right? That's the big question. Well, you end up working harder, longer, but it's hard to compete with people that get the money right off of Wall Street, on K Street and elsewhere. So the thing that you do is you end up working harder for less, and you shift your life to perhaps pursuits that you can control, whether it's your family, better health. In essence, it's the response that all countries and citizens go through when the system becomes less rule of law and more rule by the mighty. And that is what has been happening here. And Trump, the election, is an effort to turn back the clock. Whether it will work or not, God only knows, you know. So as to your question about Trump, and your remarks are totally apt, you cannot have massive tax cuts, most of which, by the way, are for corporations that will use the money to buy back their shares instead of investing in future products. And I wrote a long piece on this. So most of them are into quick fixes. We've got a problem here, a huge problem with corporate governance. We have a huge problem with corporate compensation. Used to be 20, 30 times a line worker. It's 400 or 500. Yet there's less competitive products and solutions being built, not more. So go figure, right? But as a government is no different than a family or a county or a state. In other words, you can't forever spend more that you take in, but the government can print the money. The federal government can, and that's the difference. And that's really what's been going on around the world, hasn't it? And as a result, we've had, you mentioned ZERP and NERP. We've had financial repression, artificially produced money, artificially low interest rates, which in essence, thanks to how stocks and bonds are valued, and net present value function, has exploded the value of stocks and bonds, not only because governments or central banks have bought them, but because they're more highly valued based upon a discount rate being lower. So the whole thing, I call it a toxic public policy stew, is leading in a direction which reduces global productivity, increases the split between haves and have-nots, and doesn't bring us more liberty. It brings us more tyranny. So the elections you see in Italy, the attempt at Brexit, what we've seen in Poland, there is a big movement afoot to try to wrest back control from these globalist tyrants that are running the system into the ground for their own benefit, the 1% against the 99%.
Yeah, the division right now within the U.S. Politically and socioeconomically is one of the focal points of many of the many investors, including Ray Dalio, who makes it a huge focal point for his fund. And I want to ask you, what are the consequences of quantitative tightening on asset classes, and what are the ramifications on bond prices going forward?
Well, that's a very important concept and dovetails back into what you said and I commented on interest rates. If the Fed reduces its balance sheets, it's in essence destroying money or capital, right? What it's doing is what it's created, it's now taken away. When it does that, it reduces the quantity of money, at least at the central bank balance sheet level, which then be a money multiplier depending upon, how much loans are made. It ends up in the money supply, M1, M2, and used to have M3. But what really happens, or what is happening, is we have a Fed that is trying hard to rein in the excesses of financial repression. In other words, artificially cheap money, artificially creating money, and taking away that punch bowl, even though we're not back to free market capitalist system. I mentioned the toxic policy, public policy stew, destructive, not a creative system that furthers wealth, but one which in effect reduces it for the benefit of takers and cronies and other miscreants, right? So what's happening currently is with the Fed walking back part of that QE by selling bonds and not repurchasing them or adding to it, is reducing the amount of liquidity in the world, which, as we discussed before we started this call, is negatively impacting a lot of emerging markets who still rely on the dollar for sources of funding. And this is evidenced in their currencies taking a big hit. It's evidenced in interest rates going sky high. And frankly, it's a possible contagion in the making that will spread given the global financialization and interconnectedness and the huge indebtedness of today's world. In other words, we can't really afford tough love. We can't have another Paul Volcker because we're in debt up to our ears. Yet we refuse to go back to sensible economic policy. And at the same time, the Fed is trying to play tough love, albeit from very low interest rate levels. This is not going to end well. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to have spreading problems as we did in '08, but with much bigger debt, much bigger misallocations, much lower productivity. It's going to be many times worse. What does that mean in terms of asset valuations? I think stocks are going to come under tremendous pressure. And at some point, so are overvalued bonds. And people will go back to the concept that real safe havens aren't government bonds where you have bankrupt entities standing behind them, whose only answer is to print more money, but to go back to true money, and that is physical gold and silver, which have been shunned and pushed down in price through manipulation for a long time because the central bankers of the world want to keep the ability to determine what is and what is not money.
Yeah, and obviously, coming from you, who a person who's been in the Swiss banking world for over 2 decades, it says a lot that this is what your conclusion is after an entire career in this. And we talked about this in the Wealth Research Group letter, and we will continue to follow this story, where we believe that quantitative tightening, along with rising yields for bonds, will crash bond prices, and it might even compete with the equity loss of 2008, which was around $9 trillion for mortgage holders. And we believe that this could be sort of the same situation for bondholders as well. We don't need 20% interest rates to make this happen. Going to around 6 or 7% on the 3-year bond would do it. So I'm sorry, on the 10-year bond would do it. So it's very
dicey, very dicey. Yes, you are correct. And you know what? 10 years ago, we had about $100 trillion less global debt, right? America has added debt to the tune of about 1.5 trillion a year. All debt in America is about 68 trillion, globally close to 250 trillion. So if we can't even afford to go to any kind of interest rate that would suggest that investors are getting adequate protection for both inflation risks, the printing press, and insolvency risks. That is, bankrupt governments. They're all bankrupt, right? I mean, the governments today as an entire planet are bankrupt. And, you mentioned before with Warren Buffett and corporations that can buy back stock and pay out more dividends, and that's tax advantaged. Well, those same corporations have been adding debt like crazy because the cost of debt has been low, and the return on repurchasing shares has been a good trade-off. But what happens if there are bond vigilantes? What happens if the Russians and the Chinese or others decide, or American investors decide, that bonds are a ripoff? The emperor wears no clothes. It's not going to take much to cause a change. And you know what? I said about a few minutes ago that there is not reversion to the mean. Historically, there's always reversion beyond the mean. We have been in a 36 or 37-year bull market in bonds. We have interest rates which offer investors no prospects of return in terms of a real return. They're already negative. In terms of inflation protection, we printed all this money, or in terms of solvency protection. The governments are all broke, and the only way they can repay is by printing the money, which is going to decimate the currency and the value of those bonds. So we're really in a place where a reset of the whole system and the valuations that we have are going to usher in an entirely new era in terms of what bonds and stocks are worth, especially relative to gold. And you can toss in real estate here too. And people just are not even prepared to take a look at what is likely not too far down the road. And that is both a huge risk and a gigantic reallocation opportunity, in my opinion.
Now, I want to ask you, why is the U.S. dollar trading at 52-week highs?
Well, the short answer is the Fed. The Fed that continues to raise, albeit from pathetically low levels to still pathetically low levels, interest rates because of the QT. I mean, you've got Japan, which is total Keynesian nightmare, right? You've got Europe. Both of the other two big central banks, China, put China aside for a moment, those two are still printing money. So if you stop printing money 2-3 years ago and you're now raising interest rates, well, you're going to be a magnet at some point, both in absolute and relative to what other returns are and what other central banks are doing. Plus, you know, as I do, that algos and chartists and other machines and not intelligence determines the trajectory of valuations. To a much greater degree, there aren't human beings with an HB12C figuring out, you know, what kind of risk protection one should have. And as such, once something runs, it keeps running. And we buy many times assets only because they're more expensive, not because they're cheaper and thus less risky and offer more attractive return potential. Right? Investors in general, I mean, look, you and I, your wife, my wife, we go to the supermarket. When something's on sale, you back up the truck and you buy a lot of it. Investors sell what's on sale and buy what's doubled in price. And the same thing goes for currencies. And this is insanity. But again, this insanity, at least in a strategic sense, not in a trading sense, not in a tactical sense, but this very insanity juxtaposed against the unbelievably precarious political, financial, and economic environment we find ourselves in is a huge opportunity if one allocates for it correctly. In other words, bottom line, get the hell out of overvalued stocks and bonds, get into the safety of short-term government bonds, those that don't incur duration or interest rate risk, and start accumulating positions, if you haven't already, in eternal money and what we're going to go back to determine the value of everything, and that is silver, gold, and by extension, silver. I think there are going to be huge opportunities for people to buy the Nestle's and Johnson & Johnson's and Apples and whatever of the world that are going to bring fantastic returns in terms of dividend income and great appreciation potential. But I fear that those levels will be a fraction of today's, at least in real terms.
I'll tell you a funny story that in 2008, while the financial crisis was going on, this is September of 2008, I was river rafting in the Green River in Colorado for 4 days with no cell signal. And lots of my trading goes on with covered calls and with selling puts. So I come out of the river after 4 days, 4 amazing days, and I get about 157 SMS messages and emails and calls and where are you? The world is going down. And so because I didn't participate in the panic side of it, I was kind of free in mind to assess valuations and prices of companies that I either held or wanted to hold and purchase. And it was funny to see other people selling them while I was thinking, why is Intel trading for $13 per share when nothing happened in the last 4 days to the corporation called Intel? Their financial position hasn't changed. Their balance sheet hasn't changed. The future of the chip industry hasn't changed that much. And so I made very wise choices back in 2008, 2009. And I have been selling quite a few overly expensive companies that I don't think have raised their potential to the price valuations that the other buyers have elevated them to. So I'm kind of taking profits on many of these 10-year-old positions right now, and I am thinking to myself, what will happen with the real estate market in America? Because, and we'll get to that later. So I want to ask you my next question here, and this is regarding something that we have circled around: the household debt, mortgage debts, auto loans, student loans, credit card debts. These are all debts that are not supported by a printing press. Are they even riskier for our society and for our economy than government debt? And is this threat immediate, or do you see obviously the potential for refinancing these loans, rewriting them, taking small losses? There's many ways to avoid a real crash here, but are these debts getting out of hand, or can this nation absorb more debt?
Well, I think if you take a look at student loans, all right, you think of mortgages, and in essence, Fannie and Freddie and the Fed, about a third to half of its balance sheet are mortgages, right? You've got student loans where the government has stepped in, Obama did, to in effect nationalize them. You have auto loans that are ridiculously large. You've got, people that have been buying cars like no tomorrow without much money down, or they're doing leases. But there's way too much in terms of debt relative to income. If you take a look at the American savings rate, right, and it's just been bastardized and lifted by the Federal Reserve. If you go on Fred, you can see it. It's about doubled from where it was before. I couldn't believe it as I looked over the weekend. But in reality, Lior, you have income, which is not keeping up with either inflation or the spending appetite of Americans. That's why they just achieved record debt. But it's the same thing at the federal government level. You mentioned before, how can Trump, cut taxes, which aren't going to go into the back pocket of the middle class, but they're going to end up back in the shareholders' pocket through share buybacks. But that isn't how you build better mousetraps of the future. You don't do, an LBO of the S&P 500 and hope that you're going to have the world-beating products tomorrow and the next day. But back to your question, I think all these debts are in aggregate. I mentioned $68 trillion in debt in the United States. These are all part and parcel. They are, three and a half times the size of the GDP. And are they sustainable? Well, if the cost of money or the cost of capital is low enough, and remember we discussed before, we've been in a 36, 37-year bond bull market. The last 10 years has been highly artificial through financial repression. So ask yourself, and people are noticing this, if interest rates go up, mortgage rates go up, because everyone is so loaded to the gills with debt, so leveraged, the entire economy. It won't take much, as the emerging markets are seeing now, to push things into a very negative direction. I'm talking bankruptcy. I'm talking about having to step in. I'm talking about bailouts. Well, you can bail out everybody as long as people still trust the currency which stands behind it. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of trust, isn't it? And trust is something that is hard to win and then difficult to lose. But if you do lose it, boy, you've lost it for good. And I guess my bigger point is we are skating on thin ice, so abusing the ability to create money out of thin air, so abusing that to create policies which dilute property rights, which dilute efficient allocations determined by the free market instead of by bureaucrats and politicians with an axe to grind, from green cronyism to wherever else you want to go, that we are in the United States and globally in Europe, pretty much around the world, at a point where the risk that an event triggers a massive loss in confidence in fiat money and all the debt and everything else that by definition is attached to it, that this thing could blow up. All right. And What happens? Well, we're going to get a large reset in terms of stocks being much more affordable, bonds being more attractive. But that in turn is going to spell much higher yields. In other words, the interest expense of everybody that's in debt up into their ears is going to go up. And how can anyone afford that? They can't. The world is swimming in nearly 250 trillion in debt compared to 80 trillion of global GDP. The United States has led the charge of insanity because it has had the currency with which to print itself into bankruptcy, right? So that's the burden. If you have the confidence and you've earned it in the past, but you've stopped earning it a long time ago. So where does this lead? It leads into a place where all of a sudden the music's going to stop. We're going to have problems in credit markets, and the whole thing is going to start to come apart at the seams. Trust between banks is going to disappear. We saw it in '08. We saw how UBS almost came down. And I think we are approaching that kind of a moment. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen in a month. It could happen in a year. And the music then stops. And this time around, we just have a heck of a lot more issues than we did in '08, because in '08, we kicked the can down the road at every level instead of addressing. It's like an alcoholic that drinks even more alcohol to cure his hangover. And that's where we're at. So, and the suppression of the free market and of price discovery is so extreme that the reversion beyond the mean is going to be like nothing we've ever seen. So this isn't to spout the end of the world. I'm just saying there's going to be an entirely new playing field with entirely new valuations, and debt as we've known it and how we have created it, including in the pension arena and unpayable benefits promised to everybody, it's not going to work. So this will at some point result in, I think, quite a bit of social or political upheaval. And I think, unfortunately, central banks will double down on the only thing they can do, the only thing they know, and that is to print more money. And the end result of that is going to be an inflationary problem of huge proportions as they fight debt-induced deflation tooth and nail with the only tools they have. And politicians, think of pension funds. You can't tell somebody you can't pay their pension. But if you print the money to make them good and that money becomes worthless, you can get away with that, right? So these are what I think is coming down the pike. And I think it's going to be a horrific shock for people that are not positioned to benefit on the other side.
Now you talk about many important things here, and I want to say the Wealth Research Group has just published an article about this that I wrote regarding the fact that we see, probably not now, but after the stocks peak, we see about a 40-45% potential for decline in prices. We do see the stock market continuing to rise from here on. I don't see any reason for the bull market to end with the current situation. Not that fundamentals are driving valuations higher, but the alternatives to stocks are almost non-existent. But I do want to ask you, are tariffs a bad idea? Can the U.S. have a trade surplus without renegotiating the value of the dollar down, without debasing the currency? Can the U.S. become a quality exporter instead of a quantity exporter? In other words, Dan, I'm asking again, in case the audio wasn't there. Are tariffs a bad idea? Can the U.S. have a trade surplus and become a quality exporter instead of a quantity exporter? In other words, can they become an exporter without debasing their currency severely?
That is a very good question. And it kind of ties into what you said about stock markets. Stock markets have been driven not by productivity, not by organic growth in the United States. because you can't very well have organic growth in stocks. And by the way, over time, top lines of companies can't grow more than GDP. And the bottom line can't forever grow more than the other constituencies, be that labor or government, right? So we're at the end of a long period where we've squeezed as much water out of the sponge that we can and shifted it into the shareholder pockets. And in so doing, we focused on financial engineering over real engineering, in buybacks over capital investment. America, in overstated terms, has forgotten how to produce. Okay. And a lot of this is because of the insane litigation, about 3 times as high. A lot of it is because of regulatory insanity, which Europe obviously also has. And a lot of it is because America, in essence, has been able to pay its bills by printing the money to get what it wants. So I think the big change will be, change happens when it needs to, right? And if America can't just print the money to pay for goods from China and fill Walmart stores in the non-food section and wherever else they come from Asia or Europe, at that point, when you no longer have the currency to purchase this because people don't want it, they sell it. We talked about too few dollars, the synthetic short right now of dollars thanks to the Fed. But in reality, we're going to face a situation where there's going to be too many dollars as the Fed is forced into probably what's going to be record and mind-boggling quantitative easing money printing. All right. In other words, they're going to have to monetize the debt officially, even more so than they had. In such an environment, goods in America imports will become much more expensive. And as such, the incentive will be here both by the Chinese and the Brazilians and whoever to increase production here because it will make more economic sense because they will have the stronger currencies and they will be able to buy a lot with their currencies when the dollar comes under pressure. And I think that is going to be the mechanism. In other words, a lower dollar when the very needed reindustrialization of America takes place. And along with that, you're going to have more regulatory and litigation sanity, and you're going to have to refocus schooling into trade schools and other arenas where people learn things that are actually useful in terms of building better widgets.
Sure. And I want to ask you, how can government in the U.S. be downsized? How can they be made more efficient? How can they trim the fat and accompany this tax cuts? Where would you start if you were able to have control over the Treasury Department or the budgeting? What can be done to make the federal government 4 and 5 times more effective? In other words, if it was a company like Starbucks and you would appoint the CEO of Starbucks to run the budget, the federal budget, what would he do in order to help the economy?
Well, I am not very enamored with the Starbucks CEO and his political ideas and persuasions. I think he takes advantage of a system and then actually threatens free market capitalism. But let me put that aside for the moment. Let's just call it common sense. Let's call it what's sustainable. And what's sustainable is you can't forever spend more than you take in, and you can't forever print the money to make up the difference, right? And I think that is the true answer. And it ties into the American dollar and its acceptance as the safe haven currency. I don't think for a minute, Lior, that the U.S. central government, which is totally unconstitutional, it is totally divorced from the limitations that the Constitution places on it in every way, shape, or form, including the fake money that we use, right? This is like a cancer that has metastasized through the entire organism. There are 2 million bureaucrats running around. Agencies like the EPA, think of that, the Department of Energy, are massively weaponized and have hollow point ammunition. I mean, this is the Borg, if you're familiar with the Star Trek series. And it's not going to give up lightly. And frankly, much the same has happened throughout the West. So we have governments that the people are afraid of, right? Instead of governments that are afraid of wronging the people. And anybody that's sucked into this, I'm going to call it fascism or whatever kind of tyranny you want to refer to, they are not going to let go. They're going to get the votes they need. You look at California, flip it and turn it into a fully blue state by virtue of endless illegal immigration from the third world and promise them everything and have them vote Democratic. You have a government that is totally unhinged and divorced from the founding principles of the country, which are to maximize personal freedom and personal responsibility. The circle of liberty of individuals and small businesses has been eroded to such a degree that there really is no way back, short of revisiting the Declaration of Independence in the first place. Except this time, the offensive entity is Washington, D.C. instead of London. Now, you can do various steps at the local level. You can vote for politicians. I vote, generally speaking, for Republicans, although a lot of them are just as bad as Democrats. But as soon as they get to Washington, D.C., 90% of them break all their election promises, and they run with the bureaucrats that really control unconstitutionally the government, whether it's in Japan, whether it's here, whether it's in Strasbourg, in Europe. We are run by bureaucrats that are not accountable to people. And at the same time, we have too many people that don't give a damn about trying to return the clock back to decency, liberty, common sense. And if they go along with this, then there is no easy way out short of a complete and utter breakdown of the system. So my answer to you would be, I don't think there's a way to claw this back. I mean, there are movements here afoot. I mean, Texas is drafted. You've got states that are considering, not only bringing their gold back and making gold and silver untaxed assets, which they obviously should be, but I think you have a movement afoot to set the stage to potentially divorce themselves in a non-aggressive, non-war-like way from this tyrannical construct known as Washington, D.C. But in the meantime, life goes on. We have to figure out where to invest and how to spend our energies. And I think, that's all that you can do.
Well, and on that regard, I did uncover a very important breakthrough in terms of states wanting to decouple themselves currency-wise from the federal U.S. dollar. We're talking about 12 states within the union. And we wrote about this at wealthresearchgroup.com/KellyCoin. Kelly like California and coin like a crypto coin. So you can download that and read about 12 states, including the 3 largest in terms of GDP, which are not Trump favorites, who are looking to create some sort of a loophole around the Lincoln law from 1863 barring state-issued currencies. I want to ask you lastly, Dan, and we talked about many subjects, but I've went through and did an inquiry into how the U.S. uses its land, and I think some of these findings will shock people. But I want to ask you, the U.S. is so topographically and geographically unique. It has amazing resources, and I want to ask you, can the U.S. make and produce basically all that it needs and more?
I think the short answer to that is absolutely. But here's the problem. Can someone that is 50 pounds overweight lose 30? Yes, they can. But is the will there? And that's the big question. The U.S. is a uniquely wonderful piece of real estate that has an unequal river system feeding into the Mississippi, that doesn't deal with the freeze issues that Canada and Russia have. It's got the biggest coal reserves. It's got fertile fields in the Midwest and the San Joaquin Valley in California. It has the best constitution ever written on the planet, the codification of individual rights. The Magna Carta was just a weak start for people of power in the UK. So yeah, the US has all the correct ingredients. I can sit there and I love to bake chocolate chip cookies together with my daughter. And I can have all the best ingredients, brown sugar, good eggs, so on and so forth. But if I don't combine them correctly and in the right amount, and then I don't set the temperature right, and I don't leave them in the oven long enough or too long, they're going to suck, right? So America has this gift of its political founding, of the first time that individual freedoms were codified for the benefit. Think of the blue-blooded people that founded this country that could have turned it into another monarchy but didn't. I mean, that's a huge, huge gift. It's the political structure which has to be revisited, whether it's through nullification, whether it's through Article 5, where you try to rein in an out-of-control government and get it to pay homage to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It's there. The water is here. The river systems are here. The land is here. Everything is here, and it can be rebooted. But the people that hold power, that run the media, that run the universities, that run the bureaucracies, which truly rule, not the elected officials, they have this Marxist, communist, socialist mindset. And they are so deeply into the system at every level, and they dominate the media, they dominate the government, they dominate our education. We have indoctrination instead of education. That this is so difficult to dislodge unless you have cardiac arrest of the system. And I think you can say what I'm saying for the U.S. throughout the West, which are countries of, respect for the individual, tolerance, the rule of law in one shape or other, property right protections. These are all being laid to waste by, in essence, imports from, Germany, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Marx. And these people want power and they sell it to better humanity and save the environment, when in fact it's just the opposite, right? So the big question is can people get motivated enough to revisit sanity and this wonderful opportunity here and this best constitution ever written? What will it take? But I don't think it's going to happen, and it might not be the United States that comes out of it. It might be nullification of federal diktats that ends up within the red states of creating a America revisited, if you will. But I fear that this kind of positive development will only occur once the whole system comes apart at the seams, whether it's political, economic, and financial. Because as you know, we only tend to change, unfortunately, when we absolutely have to. And as long as you can print the money to sustain the unsustainable, I think that's what's going to happen.
Definitely. Pain is one of the biggest drivers of change in human history. War, anything that has to do with extreme pain. You see it in the life of the individual. He reaches rock bottom, and then he decides to quit smoking or quit doing something else that's abusive to himself. I want to ask you, where...
Can I add one last thing, Lior, as terms of hope? I'm sorry, but when the United States was founded, and the colonists and these brilliant minds that got together that knew the best European philosopher minds in terms of liberty thinkers, okay? Those people and the people they were able to drag with them fought against the most powerful nation, industrial nation, and navy and army of the world, the UK, or London, if you will. But you know what's really uplifting? Only roughly a third of the colonists were ready to go up against this 800-pound gorilla called London. And they still did it because they were focused and concentrated, and they were not going to lose unless death does them part. So if we can get a vocal minority, I mean, look at what's happened in this country and in the West over years has been a move away from free markets, capitalism, property right protections towards socialism and worse. And it's taken them 100 years, and they started very small. So in essence, I have a big hope that if we get enough people onto the right page, we can, even as a minority, get back what we've lost. And that's what happened when America was born. So there's reasons to be optimistic here as well. It might take a while, though.
Sure. Hey, Dan, where can people follow you and read your articles?
DKanalytics.com, D as in Dan, K as in Kurz. Got very creative there, as you can tell. Analytics.com. I just put out a piece, Lior, based upon our talk over the weekend. It's post number 44. I sent it to you, I think, in email format. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Definitely, sir, and I really enjoyed it. We'll definitely have you on again. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.